Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Elliot Abrams, who is a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. He served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor in the administration of President George W. Bush, where he supervised U.S. policy in the Middle East for the White House. His most recent books are Tested by Zion, the Bush Administration and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, and he edited with Elliot Cohn, Choosing to Lead, American Foreign Policy for a Disordered World. Mr. Abrams, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Where were you born and raised?
New York City.
And how did your parents shape your thinking about the world?
Well, I would say one thing that was quite interesting. My father was an immigration lawyer who had, grown up in the Depression, worked his way through school, managed then to help people coming out of DP camps in Europe to get to the United States. I think that had an effect, partly because we were surrounded by people who spoke lots of different languages, came from different places, and all of whom loved America, whose dream was to get to America. I think that sort of drove me away from the New Left back in the days when it was so ideologically, intellectually powerful in the 60s, let's say, talking about America spelled with a K.
I see.
I never went for that.
Was there discussion at the dinner table around world events, the world Jewry, human rights, and so on?
I would say my parents were sort of normal, if you will, middle class, Jewish Democrats. People like Adlai Stevenson and Eleanor Roosevelt, not to say Franklin Roosevelt, were secular saints. There wasn't a heck of a lot of politics. Everybody we knew had the same politics, basically sort of moderate to liberal Democrats.
And when you say that the setting of your father's work and the environment in which you live, you're saying that it made you more of a patriot and actually someone who thought about the importance of defending what America stood for?
Yeah, I think it was a couple of things. I think one, even in New York, which is where I grew up, you can live a life in which the rest of the world is not really part of yours, but the rest of the world was always part of our life growing up. My father was going to Europe in the 50s to try to help people get to this country. And all of his clients were, by definition, foreigners trying to become Americans. So I think there was just generally more international exposure than in even the typical New York family. But I think it's also true that the caricatures of the United States that were widespread in the 60s, we're talking about the Vietnam War period, Watergate, never had any appeal to me because that was not the America that I was raised to see.
What about your religious identity? Was that shaped during this early period?
Well, yeah. We were again, pretty typical in the sense that we were not Orthodox. We had a kosher home, but we did not. We went to synagogue only on 2 or 3 days a year. So from a practice point of view, it was not something that was constant. But from the identity point of view, yes. I'll just give you an example of this, which people I think find quite amazing. But I remember it would have been roughly, I think it was 57, 58, 59. If somebody came to our house to buy our car, my father had advertised it in the newspaper, and the agreement was made, and these people came and came into the living room and signed the papers and everything. This was a big event because they were not Jews, and my parents' social circle was entirely Jewish. So having people in the house in a kind of social setting who were not Jewish was a big deal. So from a kind of community and identity point of view, we were very strongly Jewish.
So what about your early education? Were you in the public schools?
I was. I was in public schools for elementary school up until ninth grade. And my brother had gone all the way through to college. And when he got to college, thought, and he was actually valedictorian of his high school class in New York City, thought his preparation had been poor and advised my parents if they could possibly afford it to send me to a private school. So that is where I went for high school.
And then after high school, where did you do your undergraduate work?
Harvard College and Harvard Law School.
And what did you major in as an undergraduate?
Government.
And what field of the law were you interested in the law school, or or was it just a general education?
Yeah, I think we're, what do you do if you don't like the sight of blood? You can't be a doctor, right? You've got to go to law school.
Yeah, that's right.
So I did. I don't, things like constitutional law interested me most. Actually, I loved law school because it is, I still think, intellectually fascinating and challenging. I didn't like practicing, and in fact, tried it twice and didn't like it twice. So I really practiced, I'd say, in my whole life, about 2.5 years.
And I'm thinking here now about skills as somebody who's a foreign policy analyst and actor in foreign policy. Kennan always was critical of lawyers in foreign policy. Do you agree with that assessment, or did the law help you think through the policy debates?
I think law school is, pardon me, a great intellectual discipline, because I think in a lot of graduate schools, if I can put it this way, there's just a lot of baloney. You can get away with saying anything. There's no intellectual discipline, whereas in law school, there's a great challenge where fellow students or professors will say, defend that. Why is that true? And come up with counterexamples. I teach at Georgetown part-time, and one of the things I always ask my students when they're taking a position in a paper, example, Yasser Arafat was right or wrong to refuse to sign at Camp David. Don't just say why you're taking your position. You need to come up with the best alternative arguments. What are they? Show that you know what they are, and then knock them down. If you can't knock them down, maybe you're wrong. That comes from law school, I think. I do agree with the criticism that lawyers are too deeply involved in process. And you get paid by the hour when you're a lawyer, so process is good. It's how you get your Mercedes. And I think that we see that in American foreign policy. A good example, we'll talk about this later, but the Middle East peace process, which has now been going on for about 30 years, very American approach, process, endless meetings. It's really kind of what lawyers do. So I would agree that there's an issue here. After
you also did an MA at the London School of Economics. Did you study political science there, or did that help at all?
Well, it was, yeah, I did a master's in international relations. It was fun, and it's just more time studying more different issues. I wanted to go to Europe for a year before going to law school, which I was sure I wanted to do. My parents thought going to law school directly was a good idea, so we compromised. And I could go to Europe for a year if I could get a degree out of it, so that's what I did. I did a lot of travel that year. It was great.
When you came back, you worked for two of the great liberal senators, Senator Jackson in his campaign and Senator Moynihan. That was a very different world. What distinguished them and their commitment to the Democratic Party and to liberal values?
Well, both of them were very much internationalists. Both of them were very much patriots. Both of them were very much interested in human rights. Both of them were deeply anti-communist. We're talking about the height of the Cold War here. So Jackson, for example, was a big critic of the Nixon-Kissinger détente policies. these are the years, you know, when, for example, Alexander Solzhenitsyn is allowed out of the Soviet Union and he comes to the U.S. and President Ford won't meet him. This is the kind of thing that Jackson was criticizing. And then, of course, it was Moynihan at the UN, standing up for the United States, fighting back. All of this I thought was great. And it was a losing fight in the Democratic Party, because we're talking here about the late 60s, early 70s, the McGovern nomination. Jackson had obviously opposed. He had run against McGovern for the nomination in 72. He ran again in 76. I actually came to work for him in 75. But this was a battle for the Democratic Party. And in his acceptance speech at the convention in 72, McGovern used that now famous phrase, "Come home, America." That was not what Jackson and Moynihan stood for. They stood for a very robust defense of American interests and values.
Speaking of your background and your father's work, and then working for these two giants of the Senate, the notion then, as I remember, was one of an assimilationist America, that America would bring people in and they would become patriotic Americans and develop the skills of the culture and be committed to it. We're in a very different world now, and I'm curious about how you see that change, where the emphasis now is identity politics.
Yeah, excuse me, yes. I mean, Moynihan was the junior author with Nathan Glazer of Beyond the Melting Pot. It was a very different world. I think it was, in this sense, a better world. That is the notion of Americanization. I'm struck by the fact that when you see all the data now about asking people, how many justices are on the Supreme Court? How many houses of Congress are there? What century was the Civil War? And people, college graduates, do not know the answers. I think it's because we don't teach it. That is, we don't teach American history. We don't teach civics. I'm old enough to have had some of that back in the 50s in elementary school. And I think it's a big mistake, because what we're saying basically is, no, we are non-judgmental. The worst thing you can be nowadays is judgmental. Every culture is equal to every other. There's no such thing as American culture. This so-called Americanization is a form of oppression. Well, I don't believe any of that. I think there is such a thing as American culture. And I think that immigrants should be exposed to it. Certainly in our public institutions of education. Learn about American history, for example. Learn about American government. What percentage of kids graduating from, never mind high school, college now, have ever been asked to read and discuss the Constitution or the Federalist Papers? I think the answer is not many. None of that is good. I think from that point of view, we were doing a better job educating people decades ago. Now, we're at a point now where we have the highest number of foreign-born people living in America since World War I, since I think 1914. So the question of Americanization arises again. And I don't think it's so surprising that you see a kind of nativist impulse and an anti-immigrant impulse when the numbers get high. But the solution in my mind is not to close it off and end immigration, which I think is one of the ingredients that makes America great. The answer instead is to go back to the wisdom we used to have about teaching people how to become Americans.
You have written quite a bit on the survival of the Jewish community in the United States, and you're committed to preserving Jewish identity. I'm curious how you navigate these two worlds in a way, because you very much believe in a strong identity. On the one hand, you're very concerned about the erosion of the Jewish community, but on the other hand, as you've just stated, you really believe in assimilation and so on. How do those two things go together in your mind?
Well, I think they do, because I think, you can be a very devout Mormon and fully Americanized, assimilated American. Likewise, very devout Roman Catholic. So I don't see why that shouldn't be true in the case of Jews as well. I don't see that there's a problem here. Let me put it that way. I think education is probably the answer. I mean, the way education and religious practice, the way Mormons do it. And their numbers, that is, their retention numbers are quite high. Orthodox Jewish retention numbers are quite high too. And here I'm not talking about something that I don't approve of, which is, or would not want to practice in my own family, which is a complete isolation from the rest of the culture and community of the sort that some ultra-Orthodox groups do, even living in their own, physically in their own separate communities. All we're talking about here is education and religious practice, and I don't see that as in any way contradicting assimilation into broader American life. I mean, the notion that someone, for example, let me just take this example, federal judge. You can't be a federal judge if you're as devout a Roman Catholic as, say, Antonin Scalia. Or if you're an Orthodox Jew, or if you're a Mormon, you shouldn't be a cabinet member. These are all nonsense. So I don't see it as a public policy problem. I see it as internal problem of the Jewish community, largely revolving around schools.
The identity issue today in American politics, is there something different, qualitatively different, about the identity being asserted by certain groups?
Well, I think there is. I think there is a resistance to, if you will, Americanization. Now, there was always this problem at the religious level. If you go back, I learned this from Pat Moynihan. There was an awful lot of anti-Catholicism in the Protestant elites, and the elites in those days were entirely Protestant, really. So when Roman Catholics built up their institutions, for example, universities and Catholic schools, the desire was not to remain apart from America. It was to say, but we still want to be Catholic. I think now there's sometimes more of a desire not to be assimilated at all. Now, one of the reasons this happens, I think, is clear. If you came here 100 years ago from Germany, Poland, Italy, Ireland, you're talking about 150 years ago, you couldn't really go back and forth. And you didn't. You were pretty much here to stay. Or you went back to stay if it didn't work out. Nowadays, of course, because of communications and transportation, it's a lot easier. And we're also getting a different kind of immigration, which is to say we're getting a lot of immigration from countries just to our south. And the numbers are very high, so that you're getting less assimilation, probably. I have to say I'm not very worried about that. It seems to me, okay, maybe all that makes it a little bit slower, so instead of taking, one generation or two, it takes an additional big deal. I think if you look at the Hispanic community in America, the Latino community generally, the trend is clearly toward the kind of integration that we saw 100 years ago or 50 years ago.
I'd like to ask my guests about the skills and temperament that go with the kind of work they do. We've talked about your legal background and how it's helped you. Are there other skills and temperament that you would recommend for students if they get in the cauldron of foreign policy politics?
Well, here's one thing that I tell students. I teach at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Everybody wants to be Secretary of State. That's what they're there for. One of the things I tell them that surprises them a bit is you need to choose a team, because politics in Washington is a team sport. You're not going to be appointed today Assistant Secretary of State because people know you're the most brilliant person who ever lived. A Democrat or Republican is elected president and staffs up. And you need to be on that list or that list. So choose a team. That doesn't really get to your question, but I think it's good advice. A second thing I say to them is, write. That would have been a foolish piece of advice 40 years ago, but now because of the internet, it isn't. And I've given this advice to people, and what happens is you start writing for some obscure website or your own blog, and if it's really good, somebody sees it, and you're invited to do one piece here and one piece there, and one person in this category ends up with a intermittent column at the New York Daily News, which sells 1 million copies a day. There are websites, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, there are 1 million of them. You can get your name around so that when the time comes for you to perhaps get one of these jobs, you've got a list. Read this, I've done this. And people can say, this is a smart woman, this is a smart man. And in terms of professional training, I would have to say I'm not so big on, having done this, on government courses, and I'm much bigger on history. Because I think people don't know any history, and I would include me. I mean, I didn't nearly know enough history, and some of it you learn, self-education after college, but I think it would be better to do that in college, and I would add to that languages. It's very unlikely that, now you're hard at work and you're working 60 hours a week, that you're going to find the time to learn a new language. So if you can pick up one or two, do it. Hard languages, obviously, are going to, be harder. French and Spanish are easy, though quite useful. But Arabic, Chinese, if you can do it, a huge advantage in your life in the government, if that happens, or of course commercially if you end up in the private sector. I would say one other thing here, and that is everybody except really the president is in a certain sense a bureaucrat, right? Even the cabinet members are in a certain sense bureaucrats. How do you figure out how to be a good bureaucrat? How do you figure out, okay, I'm supposed to get this done? There's always a formal organization chart. You can look it up on the internet, but there's an informal network in any administration, a kind of political nervous system. How do you find out? The State Department just did X. What do you do that for? That's a little bit surprising. Why? How did that happen? You can't call Secretary of State every day, but maybe you know someone who might know or can find out for you. That's that network. I have found that it's an impossible thing to teach. You sort of, pretty much you have it or you don't. You have it in your private life, you have it in college, you have it in your law firm or think tank, or you don't. And I've had a couple of experiences with not smart people, brilliant people who came into government and they couldn't quite figure out how to do that. I don't think you can teach it.
In talking with you and reading some of your works, I have the sense of a tension which will lead me to my next question. The background you've described, there's a real interest in human rights and commitment to human rights. But on the other hand, you've talked about your patriotism and you've talked about commitment to the integrity and the security, actually, of the entity. So with that introduction, is the Jeffersonian ideal bringing democracy to different parts of the world that are lacking in institutions and economic development and ridden by religious conflict still relevant for the U.S. as a great power?
Well, I think it is. I really do, and I think it's part of the greatness of the United States that we don't just stand for a certain geographical area or race or bloodline. We stand for ideas, and we're created on the basis of certain ideas. I think that's still relevant today. Look, I like to tell people who are critical of the United States government, including when I'm in it, for not doing enough for human rights. A government is not an NGO. The purpose of Amnesty International and Freedom House and Human Rights Watch and all is to promote human rights, period, end of statement. Not to say, well, we have commercial interests, we have financial interests, we have security interests. No, no, no. They're not doing balancing. They have one concern. No government can do that. And so the government has to juggle and balance these. And usually, human rights is the loser. really under both parties, under almost any president. It seems to me that, and I would, let me give you the realpolitik argument for this. Very briefly, it's legitimacy. I think that illegitimate governments that rule exclusively by brute force are not stable, and over time will become more and more brutal, and their instability and their nasty nature make them not such great allies for the United States. So it seems to me that from almost, you might say, a realist point of view as well as a principled human rights point of view, we need to be concerned about human rights practices and democracy. And I think the difference here is the one that Jackson, Moynihan, Ronald Reagan saw, which is it is a very good thing to try to get a man or woman unjustly imprisoned out of prison. But they can put them in jail faster than we can get them out. The only way to end the practice is to help people create a democratic system in which people are not unjustly imprisoned. So we should be trying to help. We can't impose that, except Germany and Japan at the end of World War II as conquerors. But people are fighting for this in dozens of countries around the world. And the question is whether we help them or are indifferent. And I think indifference is a very bad policy.
I think it's fair to say you were controversial when you worked on Latin America. And help us understand how you navigate the concern about the security of the state you're committed to. And on the other hand, this concern with human rights, which is in the back of your head. I mean, because you must go through a period where people don't know that you're thinking about or trying to do the second. And
Yeah, well, there are moments where you have to just put human rights questions aside. And the best example, I think, is Stalin's Russia, World War II. There is a world war. We need them as allies to defeat Nazi Germany. So we make an alliance. And we don't say anything about human rights practices in the Soviet Union, which obviously were great crimes. You could probably come up with more recent examples. In the beginning of the Afghanistan war, we're talking about, 2001, 2002, we need the stands, Uzbekistan, because we need to be able to get supplies into Afghanistan. We pretty much overlooked the human rights questions there. I can defend those moments, I think. More broadly, though, I think it's always a balance. And I would give you the example of El Salvador under the Reagan administration. It's interesting. There is a murderous military junta governing El Salvador in 1979, 1980, including, for those who have long memories, the murder of a number of churchwomen, ultimately the murder of the Archbishop of El Salvador, Bishop Romero. But Jimmy Carter does not cut American aid to El Salvador. Why not? Well, it's kind of a realpolitik, because he believes, I think, if we do that, the FMLN, communist guerrillas, will take over and the human rights situation will get worse and be essentially irremediable. Reagan comes in. Same idea, we're not going to cut aid. But we start a policy that took years to do, ultimately succeeds, I would say, under George Shultz, of trying to create, assist, impose, choose your verb, a civilian government. Death squad killings in the period Reagan comes in, January 20th, 1981, over a period of about 2 or 3 years, death squad killings go down 90%. Ultimately, Jose Napoleon Duarte is elected president and begins the democratization. El Salvador today, by the way, remains a democracy, and the FMLN has won the election. Now, when we were doing that, it was extremely controversial because, for example, what Congress did was to say, here's the aid to El Salvador, but you can't give it unless you certify human rights progress. So Reagan would certify human rights progress. And human rights groups and many on the left of the Democratic Party would go nuts. You're lying. This is really criminal. You're misleading. What about the murders here of the Archbishop and nuns? And of course, our answer to that was, first of all, well, where were you when Jimmy Carter was doing it? But put that aside. That's partisan. Our answer to that was, there's progress. There's progress. The glass is, for the first time in a long time, maybe a quarter full, and soon it'll be half full. And then our hope. So this is the argument you have. And I, in a sense, as long as we're having an honest argument, I don't blame the human rights groups, because they're not looking at the question of a communist takeover. Maybe they should be. I would argue they should be. You're doing this balancing almost all the time. There are very few places where you have a kind of, I don't know, blank slate for human rights. I mean, if I go back to the Reagan years, Paraguay was an unimportant country. There's no canal in Paraguay. There are no bases in Paraguay. So you can have a human rights policy. That's easy. There's no other side to the question. But it's more common for it to be a fight.
So in a way, what I'm hearing here is that for an actor in foreign policy, you have to have the long view on the one hand. I mean, over time, things will move in the right direction. In the short term, there has to be a concern about security. In the case of Latin America, there was concern about the Soviet Union. If we move to Israel, you know, there's a concern about terrorism and the environment. And so the human rights thing is in your mind, but it's not a situation or not a part of the puzzle that you necessarily can do as much about.
You can do certain symbolic and sometimes real things in the short run, but you need a long-term strategy. If the goal is, again, not to get one person or 100 people out of prison, but rather evolution toward a democratic system, a system that on its own protects human rights, it's going to take time, and you need a strategy. And I think in the case of El Salvador, for example, we had a strategy and it worked. So the problem is that while you're doing this, you're going to get attacked from the left and the right. I mean, we had a strategy for Chile, for example, under Reagan, and we were attacked from the right, from Jeane Kirkpatrick, from Henry Kissinger, that we were repeating the errors of Cuba 59, Iran 79, Nicaragua 79. We were going to overthrow a friendly dictator, and then there would be chaos, and then there would be a communist government coming in and eliminating, or in the case of Iran, a theocracy, eliminating all human rights. And I mean, our answer to that was no, we're not. That's not what we're doing. And we were right. So you're going to get a lot of criticism because often the benefits of what you're doing are not visible and may only be visible in 1 or 2 or 5 years. You may not even be there by the time success is achieved or partial success is achieved. So in a certain way, it's a thankless task, by which I mean you're just going to get attacked for doing it from inside the government, from outside the government, from the left and from the right. So you have to really believe in what you're doing. And this is one of the reasons I'm such a great admirer of George Shultz. He believed in long-term strategies, and he wasn't pushed off them by criticism.
Let's talk a little about Israel and U.S. policy toward Israel, because you are seen, I guess, as a hardliner. Mm-hmm. But you have a philosophy or a perspective on what needs to be done. And I think that it's fair to say that you are concerned about Israel's security, mm-hmm. on the one hand, and that the immediate and midterm problem is really to build up the institutions of the Palestinian Authority so that they will be prepared to assume statehood. Yes. And that you can't do anything in the short term, and it's a mistake to do anything until those institutions and economic development had occurred.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I have been critical, for example, of President Clinton for what he was trying to do at Camp David, which of course didn't come off, because he was handing a state to Yasser Arafat. He wasn't saying, first you have to have a democracy, first you have to end terror. Not just, here you are. Which I think would have been dangerous not only for Israel but for Jordan. If you flash forward to today, I don't think it's changed too much. Suppose you could create a Palestinian state tomorrow. First of all, how would you guarantee that Hamas wouldn't take it over and be a danger to Jordan and Israel? If you eliminate terrorism, let's say we create a new world and there's no violence, how does that state survive? It has no airport, it has no seaport, it has no economy, it really doesn't produce much, it has no central bank, no currency, it has nothing. So how does it survive? How is it a viable state? So institution building. Now that was the theory of the former Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, and he didn't get much support. He didn't get it from us. He didn't get it from Israel. He didn't get it from the Arabs, Arab states. It's not very sexy. It's not very romantic, you know, building up the system of education and the court system and the health system and all of this. It is a kind of Zionist point of view. In this sense, you have the first Jews moving back, 1870s, 1880s. Fast forward to the Balfour Declaration, 1917. Nobody had any idea when there would be an independent Jewish state. They believed it would happen someday, and they believed they had to be ready to govern. Whether it was in 1970, go back to 1910. You don't know there's going to be a First World War, much less a Second World War. At the end of the war, 1945. Was there going to be a Jewish state in a year or two, or maybe 10 years? Just be ready. And I think that was what Prime Minister Fayyad was in essence saying. We need to build these institutions, whether it's a year or two or 10 years. They're not built. And I'm particularly insistent on the question of what people call incitement, which is the glorification of terrorism and the teaching of hatred of Israel and Jews, which has been going on and going on and going on. And of course, every president, including the one I served, says this is terrible and it has to stop. We don't really mean it. And it doesn't stop. And so even now, 2017, you're getting schools and parks and so forth named after murderers, convicted terrorist murderers. What are you teaching Palestinian children if those models are held up as the finest of our citizenry? So I think there's a lot of work to be done. I think it can be done. That is, I think that Palestine, Israel, the United States, Arab states can, working together, considerably improve the way Palestinians live and move forward. I think the problem has been in part, it's never very exciting to say to a president, nothing's going to happen on your watch, but the slow, steady accretion of institutional life. So somebody else will reap the harvest. Everybody wants the handshake on the White House lawn. I mean, Clinton did, Bush did, I worked for Bush, and that was really what we were going for. We want a comprehensive final settlement now. That's what Trump seems to want. He's not going to get it, in my opinion. And it would be much better to say, they're not ready for that now, the Israelis and Palestinians, but we can improve things and build the basis for future progress.
Politically, that's a hard choice for many reasons. And I want to focus on one thing, which I want to tap your concern about human rights, both in the sense of the human rights of the Palestinians during this interim. I mean, long term, let's not disagree, but in the short term, their human rights situation within, the West Bank, and obviously some of that comes from Hamas and Gaza. So it's not just the political situation imposed by the occupation, but also the cost to Israel in terms of human rights, because the problem of managing an occupation. So how do you think about that?
Well, the occupation begins in 1967. It continues because you can't just, as Tzipi Livni, the former foreign minister, used to say, throw the key over the fence and say, you got to have a state. It's too dangerous. I said to Israel and to Jordan, I should add to Palestinians, because if you create another Hamas state or similar dictatorship, there won't be any human rights there either. So I think you could get today a majority of Israelis to do a two-state agreement if they could be satisfied as to the security issues. I do think generally people underestimate the difficulty of this. There's a reason it hasn't been done. And it's not that it's never been tried or that people are stupid or filled with hate. No, it's because it's really hard, like Jerusalem. Coming up with a solution on Jerusalem that will be agreed by all parties is very hard. Look, on the human rights situation, there are two problems for Palestinians living in the West Bank. One is the occupation. Nobody ever, anywhere, likes a military occupation. But the second is the Palestinians themselves. I mean, you have restrictions on freedom of speech, freedom of press, political freedom coming from President Abbas, from the PA, the Palestinian Authority itself, which is in essence the Fatah party. So it's not just imposed by Israel. Also, where do you have more freedom of speech to criticize the government? The West Bank today, under a non-democratic system and under occupation, or Egypt? I'd say you got more in Palestine. Mm-hmm. So this is a very difficult problem, and it's one, there's no way of cutting this Gordian knot. I do think, however, that we should be pressing harder, we in this case being all the aid donors, particularly the EU and the United States, for an opening of Palestinian politics. In 2006, they had a free election for January 2006 for parliament, which Hamas won 44 to 41% in the popular vote. Since then, it's more than 10 years ago, the losing Fatah party has done nothing to reform itself and become a more effective and appealing democratic political party. If you want an independent Palestinian state, you must want it to be a democracy. How do you have a democracy without democratic political parties competing fairly with each other? You still don't have that. You don't have it because the people in Fatah don't want it. We should be pushing, I think, harder for an opening of Palestinian politics.
What about Israel? Do you worry about what the occupation does to the Israeli polity in terms of enforcement, or do you think there's enough of a commitment to liberal, secular values that it's a problem, but it's not pressing?
Yeah, I think there's one tragic aspect of this relating to terrorism, which is if you go back to 67, 68, 69, after Israel conquered the West Bank, there's no border. There's no border. Israelis go to Jericho, West Bank Palestinians go to Israel to go to the beach. And the border really is a creation, I would argue, of terrorism. I am not worried about this sort of what it does to Israeli values and so forth. I mean, I look at the Israeli press every day. I go there several times a year. There's an endless debate over exactly this question. What's happening to us? What are we like? What about that incident? What about that incident? And as long as they're having that debate, I think it's proof that the impact you fear is actually not happening.
The concern of the Arab states about Iran and the Shia-Sunni conflict is changing the equation, obviously. In the medium term and the long term, do you think that will lead to both a recognition of Israel and a willingness of the Arab states to come up with a reasonable policy toward the Palestinians?
You know, if I had to give you one word answer, it would be no. It has changed the situation already, as you suggest, in that there are lots of connections now between Israel and Jordan, Egypt, the Gulf states. But they're mostly hidden. They're mostly intelligence and military relationships. That's what the Arabs want. If they were to bring this out of the closet, there would be a counter-reaction from not just jihadis, but from substantial portions of their own population. So in a way, they have the best of all possible worlds now. They're getting the military intelligence relationship that they want without the political downside. I don't know that they want much more than that. they've made minimal efforts to change public opinion with respect to Israel. I would have to say, if you look at the Saudi treatment of Israel and say Al Arabiya, TV and radio, it's better. There's no question it's better. But basically, I think we're a long way from that, from that great day when everyone has normal relations with everyone else. It will require a Palestinian solution. That is not, I think, because the Arab rulers love the Palestinians. They certainly don't treat them as if they love them, and they are grudging in giving them aid money. And it isn't just because oil's only, $50 a barrel. When it was $120 a barrel, they were grudging. But again, it's politics. I mean, they're worried about their own survival in their own countries. This is an emotive issue. So there's going to have to be progress on Israeli-Palestinian relations before we reach this much better relationship.
So do you worry in the long term? Because you're talking about the long term. You built up, hypothetically, you've built up Palestinian institutions. There's economic development. But isn't it still a problem for Israel because of what we call the street in the Arab world, and the anti-Semitism and propaganda that emanates both from the Palestinian Authority and from the Arab states? So a critic of what you're saying might say, well, the long term is never going to happen, even if you get partly there.
Well, how long is the long term? How many centuries are we talking about? I'm not such an optimist about this. I think there are deep wells of anti-Semitism, of let's call it, with a less academic term, hatred of Jews in most Arab states. And poll data, I think, suggests this among Palestinians, Jordanians, Egyptians, Gulf Arabs. So I think we're a very long way from achieving that. I also think, and I've written this, again, assume away violence. That Palestinian state is not really viable. It may be viable in a certain institutional sense if you can develop, courts of law, good police force, hospital, educational system. But economically, I don't see it. And I think it's either going to lean on Israel or it's going to lean on Jordan. It's more sensible for it to lean on Jordan because it would be a fellow Arab state. And I remember an Israeli general saying to me, again, assuming perfect peace, he would not take down that security fence because he said, I want those millions of Palestinians to use Queen Alia Airport in Amman, and I want them to use Aqaba, not Eilat. And I don't want them shopping every day in Tel Aviv. I don't want Tel Aviv becoming a binational city. I want it to be an Israeli Jewish city. I think most Israelis have that view. So in the long run, it seems to me that a totally independent, sovereign, viable Palestinian state is a very hard thing to achieve. I really don't know how it survives economically.
You've been an active participant about the state of the Jewish community and its support for Israel. And you don't buy the argument that the problem is with Israel, but it's rather with the Jewish community.
Yep.
And you believe that it's really an erosion of Jewish identity because of poor education, not following even symbolically the rituals. But also you see intermarriage as a big issue. What I want to ask you is, what can you do to correct that on the one hand? And on the other hand, are you ignoring the extent that even half Jews and young Jewish people who are fully Jews, or who have both parents being Jewish, there is a concern about human rights? I mean, it's a concern for you. And so the Palestine-Israel conflict is perceived as a human rights issue.
Well, let's take the last part first. Look, Ariel Sharon was elected in 2001, came to office around the time George W. Bush did. So, wow, 16 years of right-wing governments, one after another in Israel. Not so surprising that young American Jews, who are mostly left of center, mostly Democrats, would feel a certain distance from these right-wing governments. Sooner or later, that'll stop, whether it's this year or 2 years from now, and there'll be a left of center government. And it will be much more attractive to American Democrats and American liberals, and it will talk their language. And I think some of that is the product of this odd phenomenon of 16 years of right-wing governance in Israel. But there is the other deeper problem. And I think when you ask about feelings toward Israel, if you take a young couple that marry, one Jew, one non-Jew, and they decide, we're not going to have a Jewish home. Neither of us believes in the religions in which we were raised. We're going to raise the kids without religion. And they do. And so the son or daughter grows up without any religion, and with half the family, of course, being not Jewish. And there's no real connection to, nobody goes to Israel, never been to Israel. Why would you expect that person to have some kind of great tie to Israel? So I think that with a non-Orthodox, the Orthodox are still marrying each other, but a non-Orthodox intermarriage rate of into the 60s now, 65%. This identity issue is a very big issue. Is there any way to deal with it? Well, I can think of a couple of ways. One, education. That is, a Jewish mother and father might say, well, we need to give the kids more of a Jewish education. For example, Jewish day school. The downside to that is partly financial. And it is ironic from this point of view that American Jewish organizations have been the strongest advocates of making sure that not one penny of tax money ever goes to a religious school. Because if some money were available, I think a lot more Jewish kids would go to Jewish day school. Birthright is a little piece of it. This is the program that sends young American Jews, broadly defined, one Jewish parent, to Israel. I think going to Israel, having, frankly, a great time there when you're, 18, can possibly be the beginning. I'd say one other thing. Are Jewish communities welcoming of intermarried couples? And it seems to me that the attitude ought to be, yes, and we encourage conversion of the non-Jewish spouse to Judaism, and we certainly encourage raising the children as Jews in a Jewish home rather than with two religions in the home where one weekend you go to synagogue, the next weekend you go to church. This happens. You celebrate Hanukkah and then you celebrate Christmas. That's no way to inculcate a Jewish identity. So I think the rejectionist attitude toward intermarried couples is crazy from this sociological point of view. But I think the welcoming attitude should be combined with, we welcome you and we'd like to push you in this direction.
How important is identification with Israel for the survival of the Jewish community in the United States?
I think it's quite important. If you go back and ask what were the things that created an affinity with the community, what were the identity issues? Well, first, if you're talking about the 19-teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, you had a lot of immigrants. You had a lot of foreign-born Jews who were Yiddish-speaking in Yiddish-speaking homes. This identity question didn't even arise. Okay, that's gone. The percentage of we had a large group of Russian Jews who arrived, but that's now decades ago. So the Jewish community is basically American-born. That ethnicity is diminishing. Holocaust also diminishing as it not only does
the remembrance
of the Holocaust diminishing because I think Holocaust survivors are dying out. A young Holocaust survivor now is in his or her 80s. I think that's inevitably going to diminish. The Hebrew language, not spoken much by American Jews. What is there? Okay, there's Jewish ritual and belief. And but that only affects you if you believe in it. So that's maybe 15% of the population. For the rest, the vast majority, it seems to me, Israel has to be a critical part of their identity.
And even in the face of a global agenda that says Israel is a violator of human rights. Not saying that's correct. I'm just it's hard. Yeah. It's hard work.
The Israelis are very bad at what they call hasbara, which I don't know what you want, sort of persuasion, propaganda, telling their story. Look, the left is against Israel globally. That's happened for a long time now. Maybe it's partly the 16 years of right-wing governments, probably deeper explanations too, including anti-Semitism. But it is. So there's not a great surprise that this should happen in the United States too. Why not? Why would we be immune? I think the American Jewish community and Israel have just got to try to do a better job at explaining their story. The UN here is a huge problem with its endless attacks on Israel, while virtually ignoring human rights calamities in places like Syria, let's say. There's no magic formula here. I think by any global standard, on issues that are otherwise thought to be hugely important, equality of women and equality of opportunity for women, religious freedom for minorities, treatment of gays. I mean, Israel is in the stratosphere, and people don't seem to know it or care about it. So somehow they need to do a better job. And again, I think I happen to like Prime Minister Netanyahu, but I do think that at some point they'll have a left of center government, and that'll help.
One last question requiring a brief answer. If somebody were to watch this and hear the story of your intellectual journey, what lessons might they learn if they want to go into government and do foreign policy?
Well, it takes a 40-minute answer, but I'd say very brief.
I'll give you 2 minutes. Yeah.
I once asked George Shultz, after he was Secretary of State, what does it take to be a good Secretary of State? And he thought for a minute and he said, well, it helps to have some ideas. And I would say that that is the answer, that I would tell students and other people. It isn't just about getting a job and then a better job and then maybe even a better job. It isn't about amassing power and influence, or it shouldn't be. The critical thing, I think, is to know why you're doing this. What is it that you want to achieve? What is it that you believe in? And to me, that separates a lot of people in the government. Many of them I disagree with because they're much further to the left, but they're trying for something. They believe in something, and I have great respect for that. And I think that's the thing that people should ask themselves. What am I doing this for? What do I believe in?
Well, on that note, Mr. Abrams, I want to thank you very much for this very engaging and thoughtful conversation. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us for this Conversation with History.